Welcome everyone to this parallel panel as part of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, sponsored by Servos International, of which I'm a member. My name is Rachel Ellian Baird and I will be your moderator today. And we have co-moderator. And I'm going to have Yasmin introduce herself so she gets correct pronunciation of her name.
Hello, everybody. My name is Yasmin Magmoon. I'm a service member, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for having me, and thanks for joining.
So, Yasmin will be monitoring the chat today. So, if you have questions for our panelists as we're talking, please drop them in the chat, and Yasmin will collect the questions. And at the end of the presentations, she will ask your questions to the panel for you. So if you like a question directed to a particular panel member, also include that in your question. Okay. So I want to give you a little background on why we're having this panel. Last year was my first time attending the Commission on the Status of Women as a representative of Servos, and I have some Indigenous background. And I attended all the Indigenous community events, both side events and parallel events last year, and noticed that there was an absence of the US and Canada, a noted absence in terms of Indigenous communities. So I approached Servos and asked them if as a group we would like to sponsor and create the space of Global Forum for visibility for Indigenous communities in the US and Canada. And they happily agreed, and so we created this panel. And we have three amazing speakers for you today from different regions of US and Canada to present what's going on in their communities in terms of women in poverty, which is the theme of this Commission for the Status of Women 68. They're going to talk about kind of what the issues are, the sources of the issues, maybe possible solutions, and a collective vision forward, how they see their community going forward without these issues, because we're solution oriented. And I have to tell you, I had an amazing experience. I was at the commission last week, and I was at a parallel panel ran by ONWA, which is the Ontario Native Women's Association. And they have had great success in claiming their lands back from the government of Canada. They've moved back onto what is National Park, where they were displaced to create the national parks. They have moved back. And we discussed ways to help other nations in Canada be able to relocate back to their lands that they were displaced from, which is a big issue for one of the speakers today, Elder Philomene. She's also in a community that was displaced for the Banff Park. So if there are any attorneys in the audience who would like to volunteer to litigate on behalf of First Nations, please get a hold of me after this panel. So we're going to start today with a short film gifted to me by a couple of women, incredible women. The first is Fumi Stewart. She's one of the heads of May Peace Prevail on Earth International, another peace organization. And she had compiled to participate in their flag ceremonies where they honor each nation. She had compiled some of the nations of the United States, the Indigenous nations. So I took the footage she gave me, and then I connected with an amazing Native woman in New Mexico who's a musician. I'm hoping she's on the call. I'm trying to see. Anyway, you'll hear her in this film, and you'll also see a little bit about her at the last few clips. Chenwa, much gratitude to Chenwa for contributing her beautiful spirit song for this panel. And so the film mentions that there are 574 recognized nations in the United States, recognized Indigenous nations. There are many more that aren't recognized. I can give you an example that the Mashpee branch of the Wampanoag tribe, of which I live near, the Wampanoag tribe on Martha's Vineyard, it took them 30 years and filing 1 million documents to get their recognition. So that's one example of how hard it actually is to get recognition. So there are many, many tribes that are still trying to jump through all of the protracted hoops that they need to jump through with paperwork and documentation, of which there is no trail because they were moved off their lands. So I wanted to honor all of the nations that aren't recognized but are still with us, all that they contribute to holding space on Earth. These are communities that were here for 10,000 years, lived in stewardship of the land in balance and harmony, and we can learn a lot from them. So without further ado, I'd like to start our panel with the honoring film. Thank you. Dan?
Way
Thank you. In just a moment of silence. And thanks to all the Indigenous nations. So we're going to begin today. Normally we would begin with the elder, but Elder Philomene has not joined the call yet. So we're going to begin with Denisa Livingston. So I'm just going to give you a little introduction, and then Denisa will present, and then we'll share questions. So Denisa Livingston is committed to addressing food apartheid and nutritional trauma in indigenous communities while addressing the invisibility of Indigenous peoples by reclaiming Native truth and bringing awareness to the disparities and inequities in Indian country that have been further illuminated in the pandemic caused by colonization, systemic racism, patriarchal oppression, and perpetual injustices. The work and efforts of Denisa focus on servant leadership, taste education, growing traditional Indigenous foods, gastronomy, creating new roles for society, and bridging community members to purpose and innovation. Welcome, Denisa.
Thank you. Peace Ambassador Rachel. Welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I just have a few minutes to present to you a little insight from my world and bringing our prayer, future healthy generations to the forefront. And I want to introduce myself. That was a beautiful opening. Thank you for sharing that and honoring the tribes, because that's part of our tradition, is to hold a land acknowledgement. Ya'at'e is the greeting, which means all is well. So we place that in front of us, around us, and I hope that you also implement that in your day today. Ya'at'e she'e Denisa Livingston and she'at kitachitni na shlan chishit and ebashichin ozay and etachitni dashiche do nanish ejetachitni dashanelat ayisidat na sha'e tedagon wal ya diagut a dianishila. I introduce myself in my language because as a Dine women, we are from a matrilineal matriarchal society. So we speak of our first clan, which comes from our mother, and I'm of the Red House People clan and born for the Chiricahua Apache People clan. And my maternal grandfather is of the Hopi people. My paternal grandfather is of the Zuni people. And as we think of our roles as the Dine women, I am here in the southwest area of the United States, particularly in the colonized state of New Mexico, which is part of my traditional homelands of the Netka, the Navajo Nation. And women, we are the center of the family. We are the keepers of wisdom and conservators of ancestral teachings. And our emergent stories also speak of how we learn to be matriarchs. And as we think about the day and age that we are in, much has changed in the roles of women where I am, and as well as what I have learned. I'm only giving you a glimpse of what it is to be living in this time, but also what my grandmother and my mother have been able to pass. I'm an organizer of Dine Community Advocacy Alliance. I've also served 5 years as the international counselor of the Global North for Indigenous peoples for slow food. And also, I'm a recent graduate of the University of Oklahoma School of Law in Indigenous Peoples Law. And so as I think about my role and the work that we have been doing, we've been really focusing on a campaign talking about our food systems and our broken food systems, and thinking how women's roles have changed, because we know that in most of the world, women are leading agriculture, women are leading farming efforts, and I come from the same tradition. And so I created this campaign called Building Community, and really focusing on building community, but in our language, it means kinship. Because everything that we do is based around our relationships to the land, to the water, to the air, to our soil, to one another, but also to our future and our past. And so that word is a very powerful word. And as we explore how we do this, we are addressing the history and practices of colonialism and how the impacts of colonizations of Indigenous lands and nations are still impacting to this day. We are also raising awareness on how we decolonize solidarity, or how we indigenize public health research, public health practices, especially centering on the Indigenous ways of knowing, when we talk about epistemology and epistemic violence, Indigenous people face this in many aspects of data. And so as we think about trust being one of those factors, sometimes data in our relationships center on the speed of trust. We're also focusing on how we can build Indigenous frameworks, methodologies, thinking that social determinants of not only health, but health equity is critical in the work that we do. And then as well as thinking about indigeneity as a factor of social health determinants. And so thank you everyone for joining and learning about the work that we are doing. I've been leading this grassroots organization for over a decade. And as we have centered our work on food systems and food policies and thinking about how my tribe were sent to what is called the long walk, when our people were forced up to walk over 500 miles to southern New Mexico to a place called Bosque Redondo by the US government. And we are forced to this concentration camp where salt, sugar, and flour that were never a part of our body, white sugar, white salt, white flour were not a part of our diet. And our people remain sick to this day from the CRAP, the CRAP, the carbonated refined artificial processed foods that were introduced during colonization. And to this day, we are still facing the nutritional trauma. And we've been trying to address our colonized food systems and the impact of unhealthy food and beverages, and also how we can implement TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, to be able to find interventions and explore interventions and increase advocacy regarding this. So during the pandemic, it really highlighted the need to focus and think about how women's roles have shifted. Before we were sent to the concentration camp in 1864 to 1868, which is when the treaty was signed between the Navajo people and the US government. The roles of women, women were leaders, women were the decision makers. And after the long walk, the roles shifted because there became now an increase centering on men to be the leaders and men to lead government and men to lead the tribes, and the influx of missionaries stressed that men should be leading the home and ruling and controlling the government. During the pandemic, my tribe and New York were the epicenters of the pandemic. As I have done research, this wasn't the only time in the last pandemic. New York was reaching out to the Navajo Nation to be able to help during that time. And as we suffered and lost many elders due to the pandemic, especially women, because as women were the leaders of their families, and they died during the pandemic because they had increased now their participation in leading families and contributing towards the solutions on addressing COVID. And during this time, our organization, I was on the radio from New York to Berkeley, raising awareness about Indian country not being prepared for this pandemic. We advocated to our government to increase the awareness of the need to address what was going to happen. And all was too slow in response, and as well as funding that had come from the government, the CARES Act, the Relief Act, that were delayed. And as we needed to think about the women as our sacred women, we're leading the change and also the calling to find ways of healing, but also protection. There was increased vulnerabilities as well. We've seen the increase of poor healthcare, poverty, trauma, increased vulnerabilities. And as we think also about how our women have been disproportionately victimized by violence, although during this time, communities were joining together, we also seen the increased need to address those that were now at home in a violent home, or even in a place that was unsafe for them. And more than 4 in 5 of our American Indian, Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. And on some tribal lands, women are murdered up to a rate of 10 times the national average. One of my sisters here wrote about the need to be able to think about how women's roles have also changed to think about farming becoming an act of healing. Sunny Klashiliji, she has been writing and exploring and upholding the need to support women as leaders. And so as we think about the perpetual injustices that we have faced, not as only as Diné people, as Navajo people, but as Indigenous people, we also think about the need to know that these disparities and inequities were pre-existing before the pandemic. They just widened, and this really opened the door for the world to see what was happening during this time, but also now as we are still in a pandemic and trying to address the consequences of it. So women's roles in extreme realities and in the rural and remote areas that we live, 30 to up to 50% of my people do not have access to clean running water. So during this time, that also became an issue, as our people did not have access to even wash their hands, or even for clean drinking water, or for a safe environment for healthcare. And thinking about these vulnerabilities has placed us to speak more about the sacredness of water, that water is life. And during this time, NASA has been showing the images of our area of the Southwest, that you can see our drought. You can see that there's very little water, and it hasn't been this dry since 1200 years now. And as we think about the need to be able to protect our water, my grandmother, Jessie Harrison, has been to Congress 6 times in her lifetime. She will be 93, according to her birth certificate, in 2 days. But also, really, I think she's going to be 95 years old because she was born at home. But my grandfather, her husband, died from direct contamination of uranium when the U.S. government opened the uranium mines on our lands for the Cold War era. And to this day, we are still impacted by that. So in the state of Arizona, which part of our Diné Nation is in 3 states, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, we have been fighting for water. We've been litigating water, and most recently, the Navajo Nation has been in this litigation for water rights. Last year, the Supreme Court ruled against our tribe to have water rights. And so we've been in this litigation for the resources under the ground, and the uranium had contaminated our water, our air, the soil, but also the radon gas that was emitted from homes that were, according to the New York Times, 900 overtimes that standard. And so last week, my eldest uncle, my mother's older brother, who has spent his lifetime to address the need to support uranium victims and their families across the world, he was at the State of the Union. And there was success last year. President Biden had expanded the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. So last week, this was a huge accomplishment to be able to know that this is being addressed at this level, and it's time for us to be able to think about the realities in what has happened on Navajo. And so one of the really other pressing issues is other countries have been accessing the water unregulated. If you had heard in the news, Saudi Arabia had been pumping water for their farms for hay, and the amount of water that was being pumped for their farms in Arizona was unregulated. And here, us as tribes, we have been fighting for water and fighting for the sacredness of protection of the water. And as advocates, as we think about advocating about clean water access in and access to food access, and as well as awareness of intertribal collective efforts of restoration and healing. These are some of the issues that we have been facing. So as we think about increased vulnerabilities and also invisibility, during this time that we started our work, we are known for passing the Healthy Denomination Act of 2014, and that was really, quote unquote, the junk food tax. But we've learned that there's no such thing as junk food. There's junk, and then there's also food. And we've also learned that we did not have the word in our language for unhealthy food because it never existed in our diets. So we had to create the word Ian Bijol, which Ian means food and Bijol means crap. It means the scrap. It means the unhealthy food. It means the non-nutritious food. It means the harmful food. It means that food that is causing pain and disease in our bodies. So Ian Bijol, we needed to raise awareness about this because at that time, the USDA had said that the Navajo Nation is, quote unquote, 99% food desert. And so most of our foods were coming from these processed unhealthy foods, and we needed to also increase awareness for the need to support healthy food. We advocated for tax-free healthy food when more than half of my people live below the poverty line, and on the outside of the Navajo Nation, healthy food was tax-free, but yet on the Navajo Nation, we are being taxed for healthy food. So these sister laws became into effect in 2014, 2015. And what we really wanted to do was, how do we take something so negative, talking about historical trauma, talking about nutritional trauma, and turn that into something positive? So to this day, we are still the only unhealthy foods tax in the US. We are taxing everything in different categories, from soda, chips, candy, desserts, processed foods, alcoholic beverages, foods that is very harmful to our bodies. And we use that food tax. It's a 2% tax in addition to the current sales tax. So it could be 7, 8%. Some townships on Navajo are up to 11, 12, 13% taxation. And this tax is used and given to all 110 Navajo Nation chapters, which are the sub-governments. And these communities create their wellness projects. So they come together and create a plan for the revenue, and they can create anything from built environments, improvements to current projects, food gardens, traditional healing practices, like traditional food, cooking food classes, talking about healthy marketing as we think about target marketing in convenience stores. They can use that for that, clean water, recycling initiatives, or even match funding. And so this has really been a dream come true. And although we wrote this policy before the pandemic, we even wrote in the policy for health emergency preparedness. So during the time of the pandemic, our communities were able to use this funding to purchase water, food, PPEs, masks, items that they needed during the pandemic. And I just want to give you just an idea of what the taxes have looked like as we started in 2015. You can see 1.8 million in 2016, and then it started to go to decrease. In 2021, we are at 1.4. But can you see the impact from 2021 to 2022 that we rose $2.2 million? This is a great indication that during the pandemic, my people only had access to these convenience stores, sometimes the grocery stores, and it's a few grocery stores. We only have about 11 grocery stores, and people had access to nothing but unhealthy food. And when we needed more healthy food, mutual aid, or organizing needed to focus on traditional healing foods, and then also indigenous heirloom foods, which we took part of in talking about seed sovereignty. We distributed seeds, and now we can see an increase of those farmers markets across our communities. But so far, we have raised over 12.7 million to be able to give back to the Navajo communities for community wellness projects. And you can see we were starting to decrease, but this changed during the pandemic, and we continue to follow because these numbers are also at partial compliance. So as we think about the work that we are doing on Navajo and folks want to become involved and then also support the efforts, please reach out to us or even reach out to the Navajo community that you're interested in. One of the other really critical things that we have accomplished last year for the 27th annual Sheep is Life celebration, the Dine people have been stewarding the Navajo churro lamb. The Navajo churro sheep is part of our culture that was introduced by the Spaniards and have become a way of life. Our elder, Roy Cady, who's here in the red, there's my parents. There is the president of the Navajo Nation, Dr. Boo Nygren, one of our elders in the white who has led some of this work, there, myself, and then also Chef Mackie Bancroft, who is also supportive of the work that we are doing to talk about taste education. But the Navajo churro lamb has brought many healing practices as far as the increase of shepherds and weavers and fiber artists, and as well as apprentices to learn about the way of life that has sustained the Navajo people. And so we went to the president's office in Window Rock, Arizona, and the president signed the proclamation. So every third week of June from now on will be Sheep is Life. So this year will be the 28th annual Sheep is Life celebration. It is a popular event, and last year we had it at the Navajo Nation, excuse me, and this was at the museum. And this year, please look out for information regarding this. People come from all around the world to attend this event. And when we think about our awareness of focusing on our Dene language revitalization, thinking about the UNESCO's Decade of Indigenous Peoples' Languages and the protection of it, we're also talking about social gastronomy. How do we return to our ways? How do we reconnect? How do we connect with our cultural values and our heritage, especially as Dene people, many Indigenous nations that are also matriarchal and matrilineal. We're talking and helping our youth to change and also to be introduced to healthy foods, but also Indigenous foods from all different tribes. We've been around the world to be able to host these events and also be in communities to learn about one another's foods. And I just like to thank the partnerships with Native Americans out of Arizona, who have connected us here with Sarah Voss International to hold this webinar and to think about their youth leadership cohort that we've been a part of, to think about how we are exploring foods together and thinking about taste education and as a way to achieve in a small way some of the solutions that we face of similar challenges across some tribes in the Southwest. One of the other international campaigns that we've started is Let's Eat In, Let's Eat Indigenous. So eating together, eating locally, knowing who the growers are, connecting with the local people. We have been part of different universities, and one of our current applications that's open right now for our Indigenous youth. Please share this information. We are taking applications for you to come. We've had youth come from around the world to participate in this program, where we teach them how to cook Indigenous foods, how to have relationships with our foods, and then also to serve one another. As we think about how we need to protect our traditional ways and to teach that our lives are sacred, we can compost our grief in this way and think about how we are planting seeds for the future. Here are some of our resources. Our latest book that we have been a part of, The Slow Lane. My colleague Sasha Hazelmeyer, he published this out of Germany. Please get a copy. I believe it's on an ebook as well. Unfinished Conversations is one of the chapters I wrote is on the power of squash, beans, and corn. This is from Ashoka. And then we also have on our website at dineadvocacy.org the recipes from Turtle Island. This was in collaboration with the United Nations. I was one of the food systems champions in the last summit. And as we organize recipes from Indigenous chefs from Turtle Island from North America, we are able to put this cookbook together. The other one is Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. This has won 4 International Gourmet Awards, and I talk about the policy in depth of the Healthy Dinner Nation Act. So please, see these as resources that you can share and have with your organizations, your families, your children, your colleagues. And one of the last slides here, I want to talk a little about the international work. I was part of Slow Food, and some of you here have participated in our events. We had an international Indigenous Terra Madre network that we have created. Every other year, we meet in Italy for the largest food festival and talking about heirloom foods. We've been in different countries around the world to be able to raise awareness about our food systems and the vulnerabilities that we face. Here's a picture of my team, the advisory board from the last council, to be able to think about our relationships as Indigenous peoples, and thinking about how we can be protected by our Indigenous languages against disease, especially food-related diseases like diabetes, and how our stewardship matters in how we position ourselves for purpose, healing, and joy. Every other year between those events, there is the International Indigenous Terra Madre events that were held, and they were on hold during the pandemic, but you can definitely go to Slow Food website and explore some of the resources, but also the events that are held worldwide. A couple weeks ago, we held the Slow Food USA, what is called the Slow Seed Summit. And so I was a speaker there talking about sugar and the impacts of that. And we had other panelists who are growing sorghum and also sugarcane in Hawaii. We need more advocacy around sugar and the impacts of what it does to our bodies as Indigenous peoples and the harm that is caused, especially by colonization. So as we think about some solutions in building tribal health solidarity together, we really need to synergize with Native nations, understand some of the present day issues like I have addressed and the historical inequities, and thinking about who's authoring and designing these frameworks for our people. Placing authority and opportunities at the local level, knowing that community-oriented care is very important, especially when it comes to honoring our heritage and our culture. Increased participation of tribes and tribal citizens is important in our conversations, in our dialogues, in events like this today, but also in global events. Which Rachel had expressed, the need to be able to host something like this. And I really appreciate today's sharing, but also centering on rural innovation and social innovators to be at the forefront of introducing solutions that include ancestral knowledge and inclusion of Indigenous practices and traditions that have a balance of the local ecology, human health, and also harmony, because those are part of our traditions and values when we talk about our food systems and food economies and ecosystems. And right now we have been really charged in holding food is medicine, and knowing that we need to protect our soil for healthy soils, and then also how we are helping the next generation to embrace this concept, but also the practices. So lastly, thinking about our biocultural and ecological restoration, and how we can decolonize our mindsets and our practices, but also know that we can encourage improvement and growth together, because joy and justice work is very challenging, but also very much needed collectively. I would like to close with this. As I studied federal Indian law, and the need to be able to address almost every aspect of our livelihood, because Indian sovereignty has been a pendulum with the United States in our relationship that affects our tribal sovereignty today. And this sovereignty really needs to be defined and affirmed and asserted by Indians. And this is something that we want to advocate, that we have these different ways of being, different ways of knowing, but we also need to know that our sovereignty may differ from one another as tribes, and that ultimately needs to be left up to our Indigenous nations. So the exercise of tribal authority is a core aspect of our individual identity, including cultural, psychological, and economic values. Tribes are the creators and curators of organizing towards healing and restoration with a balance of tribal sovereignty, meeting present-day solutions and interventions not bound by remedies used in the U.S. And I want to emphasize that many of the solutions and conversations have been held by oral traditions, and much of what we learn is coming from conversations with our elders, with our parents, with our communities, that are not found in textbooks, that are not found in black and white, that have not been written. And this is why it's so important that we hold dialogue. I will put in the chat the link. We had an international publication on the need to support knowledge bearers and also knowledge interpreters, because as we think about research and Indigenous methodologies and the need to be able to restore our communities with community, it's important as we think about how research is done. And so I will share that in the chat. And I just want to really thank everyone for listening for this short time that I have to present to you some of the pressing issues, but also knowing the value of Dine Navajo women and what we have contributed, and also what we continue to contribute, because the Healthy Dine Nation Act was really led mostly by women and by the vision of women to protect our communities from unhealthy processed foods that have been introduced during colonization. So as we continue to conspire together, which conspire means breathing together, if we cannot change our narrators, we cannot change the narrative. And so think about how you are contributing, and know that hope and responsibility and courage is an act of love, and love is our action word as we think about healthy future generations. And this picture here has been created by our youth. It is a J Bazil, which means strong heart or heart strong. Ahihat.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Denisa. Fantastic. All right, so our next speaker will be, I'm trying to pull up my document, sorry, that I can tell you better. Here it is. And I apologize if I don't pronounce this right. I've been working on it. Baabiitaw Boyd, Ojibwe Anishinaabe, is a community leader in language recovery, tribal government, and education. In the name of language recovery and strengthening Anishinaabe identity, Baabiitaw pursued an education in linguistics, leadership, and behavioral sciences. She's going to tell us all about the movement of language recovery in the identity and cultural container and of her peoples, and how it is one of the ways forward for her community and ours. Thank you. Welcome, Baabiitaw.
Oh, here I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Baabiitaw gijugu kwenin Indigenous, mino adash ma Mrs. Aga igining wenjian, mino adash dayawag anand nini janasag and dayawag miniswe, dayawagig, mino adash koge nungum, mi windamage magarji, garji, gianige kendamana o. In the Gaza de Wea, Mino Adashkoge, Hasagijuni Hawewin, Mino Adashkoge Magijina de Mawaga, Norwegianish Nabim. So today I wanted to talk a little bit. I'm going to do a little bit of bilingualism here for everybody, just to honor the language. And I am like Rachel said, I am a Ojibwe language revitalization specialist, and it came from it kind of was something that I've always known that I was supposed to do. So my background is language revitalization, and I come from a small community in central Minnesota in the United States. It is a community of Ojibwe people that is about 5,000 in population, but spread over, I would say 75% of those folks are spread inside of Minnesota in the geography, but also across the nation and across the world. Our government is very small, but it's very mighty, and we have had a significant religious and spiritual history that has lingered a little bit longer and has kind of survived, is kind of on the brink. We're trying to take good care of it, but it's on the it is in jeopardy. Can I ask Daniel to pull up my slides, please? So when I was approached about this particular panel, I thought about this topic of poverty, and in my work in language revitalization and working directly with my community, I've always known that we've had challenges with money and keeping up with ourselves and taking care of ourselves. And I never knew that it was something that was systemic, and I never knew that it was something that was intergenerational. But this is called poverty Gemage Inigazo Dewia. So Inigazo is the word for he or she is pitiful. In Ojibwe, it doesn't necessarily mean destitute or that we're without money. It more so is this this feeling of lack. And so can I go to the next slide, please? These are my children. I wanted to introduce my babies because these are the ones that I am responsible for making sure that they speak in Ojibwe and that they know themselves as Ojibwe people. And so I'll give some more background on that. I was not taught Ojibwe as a child. I was not around Ojibwe speakers, and there were no more fluent speakers in my family. We just so happened to be participants in some of our religious ceremonies that took place seasonally, and I always had a nagging curiosity about what was happening. And in some of those spaces that children should be seen and not heard, and so you couldn't ask questions, and there was this huge gap that was taking place as far as like this normalization and understanding the mainstream language and education practices, public school mandates, and the lack of educational opportunities from an Indigenous perspective were really detrimental, I think, to myself. And so I take it very seriously to make sure that my children are confident Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people. And while I was working on Ojibwe Moen as a student in high school and college, I realized that I was very attached to it, but I had such a terrible time in public school that I was not able to, I didn't really have the confidence that a public school could give like an Anishinaabe person. I didn't learn anything about myself. I was too Indian for my relatives that were nearby, my Indigenous relatives that were nearby, and I was too white for my Indigenous relatives, and I was too Indian for my white friends at school. And so there was this really uncomfortable place that I had to find, that I had to kind of wade through as a young person. And so in 2005, I was afforded an opportunity. Can we go to the next slide, please? In 2005, I was afforded an opportunity to work with fluent speakers. So the Mille Band of Ojibwe, where I'm from, they offered a program that was kicked off by an idea of master apprenticeship that was, I believe it was created by some linguistic folks in California. And because in Indigenous, I would say because Indian governments are so underdeveloped, and the majority of them are cookie cutter Indian Reform or Indian Reorganization Act type of governments. It's more like a committee and a little less government. And what happened was, when we took on the Master Apprentice program, there was a lack of structure and a lack of accountability. But me being somebody who's very attached to the language, I kind of ran with it. And these are my elders on this slide. So the gentleman, that's Obazan. So Obazan, I spent the last 19 years working with Obazan. So 2005, roughly, I started working with him, and he's a spiritual advisor and a ceremonial and religious person. And so in Ojibwe territory, we don't, being in Mille Lacs specifically, we did not have a lot of influence by the church. And we owe that to some of our religious practices that were already in place, and the diplomacy that the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe exercised allowed for some concessions by the Bureau and by the federal government, that we just kind of we're kind of left to our own devices, and we're able to maintain a lot of our ceremonial practices. That being said, we don't particularly practice, or we don't practice our ceremonies in English. So we practice all of our ceremonies in the language that was given to us by our deities. And because of that, and because of the lack of instruction in school, and this mentality over the last few generations of it was the racism that people experienced, the racism that people experienced, the lack of appropriate education methods for Indians in Minnesota, and there was this momentum growing of English only that was happening. And then what has happened as a result of that is that we have less and less fluent speakers in our ceremonies, and we have more and more people believing that our language is kind of a relic, is like something that is just in the past. And so while working with fluent speakers, I learned a lot. These other ladies on the side here were folks that we wrote books with, and and this nice little lady down here, she's a religious woman as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is supposed to be humor. During that master apprenticeship, I was able to spend 20 hours a week with fluent speakers, to my almost completely hands off, and I was able to spend 20 hours a week in a classroom. So in that classroom, I was in a preschool Head Start classroom that was for ages 3 to 5, and I watched and witnessed how education took place in that space. And I did not have a strong sense of learning, and I did not have a strong sense of I was not a studious student. I was not very, very good at it. But those types of behaviors and thoughts about myself being successful came from that education that I had in public school. And throughout this learning, I watched teachers teach in English, and it was kind of like a on-the-job training, so to speak. And eventually, when my apprenticeships were ending, I think it was about 7 or 8 years I was doing that job, I still hadn't been able to pull together proficiency, and we were moving into a different building. And what had happened was, I'm sorry, I'm freezing. I lobbied the director of Head Start so that we could produce a no English speaking classroom, even though I wasn't proficient yet. And we had these incredibly fluent speakers, hyper fluent speakers of Ojibwe that were in the school already hired as grandmas, and they would visit the kids and they would read to them, but they were completely fully English speaking because there was no requirement because they had been convinced in their lifetime, and they're all in their 70s and 80s, they were convinced in their lifetime that nobody was ever going to learn Ojibwe. And so we did start a preschool immersion in our Head Start with some allies in the administration. And I rotated the grandmas in on a schedule. And on the time that I had downtime, we wrote down during the classroom period, while I'm stumbling to make sentences work, we wrote down everything that we didn't know how to say on the fly, and we held it together. And then on our downtime, when we would go into the grandma's area and we would spend time with them and ask them all of the questions and all of the things to say. So from the beginning of the year, we did an oral proficiency interview of 3 minutes long. And at the end of that school year, we did our oral proficiencies interviews at 35 minutes apiece of the teachers. And so that was kind of, that showed the Mille Lacs Band, and it showed our local communities that immersion works, and immersion is kind of the only thing that works. The United States is one of the only countries, I'm assuming, that offers their second language requirements in high school, where we know that languages are learned in the younger years. So I know that I'm kind of jumping all over here, but what I'd like to do is kind of boil this down to advocacy. Now, I was working inside of a system that I didn't understand, because there's not a lot of education behind, like, Anishinaabe civics. There's not a lot of education behind tribal governments and how they function. You just kind of have to sink or swim. And so at a certain points, when I was trying to advance preschool into kindergarten, and we were teaching year after year after year for children to become proficient and then go right into a kindergarten that was English speaking, it was so much of a heartbreak. And so during my time in that space, I learned about partners in other areas that had proficient, like they had immersion schools that were going up to the 6th grade and 7th grade in Ojibwe. And so I spent a lot of time trying to learn best practices from other institutions. And so in Ojibwe country, can we go to the next slide? In Ojibwe country, yep, this is just something I wanted to share with you folks. In school, we hear the same messages as our peers, that you can be whatever you want when you grow up, but nothing about your education says that if you want to be Indian, you can do that too. That thought came to me when I was struggling to understand why my education didn't work for me, and what I had to do to be somebody that supported a redesign and a reform for our education, because the Indian Reorganization Act type of governments that tribes have in the United States only allow for them to follow what is mandated by the Bureau of Indian Education. And even though the Bureau of Indian Education supports language revitalization, the infrastructure, the human resources necessary so that we can make Indians into teachers, they're proficient and they have teaching skills at the same time, that is an almost non-existent pipeline. And so I spent a couple of years working with the Hawaiians and a couple of other nations to understand how they made in their state, in the state of Hawaii, how did they make legislative changes to support that pipeline to be designed, in investing in their institutions and helping the Hawaiians who were boots on the ground redesign what education meant to them, and creating a pipeline from preschool to PhD in their Hawaiian medium. And so I studied that for a year or two, and then I came back to back to my tribe, and I'm sure that some of my colleagues on here can attest to the challenges of returning home after having gone out and got an education. That it was an uphill battle, to say the least, to try to convince people that you could be smart and you could be a smart person and speak Ojibwe at the same time. That is still something that we're working on. So at the Mille Lacs Band, when I returned from my education, I went to Hawaii and I did a couple of degrees in Minnesota. But when I when I came back to work for my tribe, we actually had an underdeveloped workforce development program. And so in the United States, there is this program called that's just the Public Law 102477 supports the aggregation of federal funds so that Indian tribes can relieve themselves of an administrative burden of grant reporting and financial reporting to a degree of having like 6 different reports. And so there's this aggregation that can take place if you qualify. And so what I did in that executive director role is I helped the department redesign what it meant to stabilize families. How do you make a strong Indian? And we knew from all of the work in the past, 15 years at that point, that our fluent speakers said children need to be able to speak Ojibwe. They need to be able to understand all of our religious ceremonies. They need to be able to visualize and manifest their own help and support during these ceremonies, especially when it comes to funerals and grief, because grief is so powerful. That we wanted to make sure that children had the opportunity to stay Indian, to stay Anishinaabe, because at this point, they're either in a bureau school where it's English speaking only, or they're in a public school nearby that is English speaking only. And with the with Indian gaming and revenue coming in from Indian gaming and other ventures, we are in a position to support any programming necessary. But because we are so far gone in this intergenerational identity crisis and language crisis, that we have folks in our own tribe, in our own leadership positions that are like pushing against language revitalization, to the point where they're saying like, you all think you're better than us because you speak the language. We're not supporting this. And it's been kind of a heartache to see that we have a lot of feelings of shame and discomfort when it comes to experiencing Anishinaabe life. And so it's very dynamic, and it's very it's very overwhelming. But in the when those challenges unfolded, and we believed that we were making a difference, even though it was a small difference. It was small pieces that were being repaired within our own government and our own schools, especially with that little immersion school that we started. We have been empowered to start using 501c3s, nonprofit organizations, to build partnerships and to gain the trust of philanthropic givers. And we were able to design a couple of institutions together that are supporting language revitalization at a more intense pace than anywhere else. And so at the Wadu Kudaring Ojibwe Language Institute is located in Wisconsin, and that is Wisconsin in the United States. And at that school, it's kind of the hub of language revitalization. And what happens there is there's preschool, kindergarten to, I believe, 7th grade now this year in Ojibwe language. And they begin English instruction, even though these children are English fluent speakers from their home. They begin English language, English arts instruction, I think, in the 4th grade. And so it's a very intensive program, I guess you could say, and it's very academically rich, and the rigor is high. And we have children that are doing very, very well. And we also have partners at this institute where at an Indigenous Language Institute partners that are doing a study on the academic progress of our children that are present there, and then their peers in the bureau school. And all of the preliminary results are showing that our children are doing advanced, they're placing much higher in their testing, and their scores are much higher in their testing than their counterparts. And I think that kind of research is going to be helpful in supporting our funding efforts and trying to make sure that we have stability in our future in the work that continues. The other institution that we have kind of built to help strengthen immersion programming is that we took it as a model from the Hawaiians and all of their communities being spread out in these islands. And we thought about reservations and Indian communities that are, you know, these small islands of people, so to speak. And we created something called the Midwest Indigenous Immersion Network. And so it's kind of a hub and spoke model where we have a centralized place that holds, houses, and curates Ojibwe language immersion resources. And what happens is that all of the partner schools that are involved and share an agreement with us are able to access those resources free of charge. And so we are trying to make sure that all of the teachers are not reinventing the wheel, that they all have resources and access, because in Ojibwe territory, there are limited books, there are limited resources, there are limited, and this just is about, this is really about the communities that, the struggles that Indigenous communities suffer from as far as economic and health disparities, educational gaps. Those things are all a combination of and kind of mirroring our language. And I want to just I want to give Denisa some appreciation for some of the things that she said about language, because we truly believe that our language is our health, because of our, we have a, with the language gap, we have a loss of understanding our natural world where we get spiritual and emotional help from. We have a loss of the natural world where our food and our medicine comes from. And that we know that all of these foods that were given to us by our deities are very close by and they've sustained us for generations. But the further and further we get away from that in our language and in our education systems, the more and more unhealthy we are. And then also, I wanted to make a mention that I'm getting away from the 501c3s, but I wanted to make a mention about our ceremonies. So we have religious ceremonies where people can come to make requests for their health. And it took me over a decade in those ceremonies to realize that the people who are asking for help with their diabetes and their blood pressure and their congestive heart failure and sometimes cancers were almost all lifestyle choice related. And it was and lifestyle choice related and now that I know some of the things that Denisa shared with us today, it's not just lifestyle choices. It's like, these were the only options. These were the only options that our people had, that were the highest options, the easiest the cheapest options. And I'm going to use some of the things that she shared with us today to keep spreading that message. But going back to our health ceremonies, our ceremonies, the people are seeking their physical health support by through these ceremonies and being with the language visual, and they're not able to visualize and manifest their healing because of that language barrier that we're experiencing. And so I have made it a kind of part of my personal journey to not just educate my own children, but to help create as many ways to support folks in learning Ojibwe language, and also other Indian people, trying to help support and empower their initiatives. And one of the things that, one of the initiatives I led at the Mille Band was that we partnered with Rosetta Stone. So Rosetta Stone obviously is a company that globally has supported language learning and second language acquisition for the past few decades. Back in the day, it was cassette tapes, and then it turned into CDs, and then it turned into CD-ROM, and then all of a sudden we have these wonderful apps. And so, and artificial intelligence now, which is controversial but we're working with it. What we have done is the Mille Band has negotiated a partnership with Rosetta Stone that looks like 6 years and 6 levels of all of the levels that they can create for second language acquisition through these apps. And what it does is it provides like easy, it provides access to language learning that is scaffolded, which no other program, no other curriculum, nothing has ever done before in Minnesota, Wisconsin at all. So you have tens of thousands of Indians that now have direct access to language if they pursue the subscription. Not only that, is there's an artificial intelligence speech recognition software built in so that it can tell you if you're mispronouncing it. So instead of just trusting your ear and hoping that you're saying it correctly, we have that algorithm designed to support second language acquisition in that fashion, because there's a lot of shame. I'll tell you again, there's a lot of shame when us Ojibwe people, excuse me, don't know our language. We somehow feel less Indian. We feel less worthy. We feel kind of, we feel like we're broken, like something is missing, this vacuum, this void. And it's very burdensome. And so what happened is that when we were designing the Rosetta Stone, when we were rolling it out, we also said, like, this can be taught in the, like, in your own home. Like, you can have it in your own, like, in a non-confrontational place, and you can learn at your own pace. It's there's testing involved so that you can kind of go back and repair any kind of learning issues that you might have. And then also there's a teacher version of it so that somebody can be assigned as an administrator to a set of licenses, and then that person can track the progress and track the participation. And so we're trying to kick off Rosetta Stone and administer and roll it out in the whole state of Minnesota as into all the public schools, because we have so many Indian children in our public schools with zero access to language, zero access to knowing about themselves. And also the schools are the ones that are saying, we don't have anything to teach these Indian children. Like, we want to offer it, but we don't have any resources. And so we tried to kind of kill multiple birds with one stone, the Rosetta Stone. And I'm not that funny, so I don't know how I came to say that. But it's been really, it's been really successful. I'd say that we've had over 100 Indian tribes in the United States have purchased our Rosetta Stone, meaning that 100 different types of Native Americans in the United States have pursued this. 100 different tribes have, and going through that list of tribal people in the beginning really put that into perspective for me. And the thing is that they're not necessarily trying to learn Ojibwe, but they just want to see it in action, right? So they're paying the subscription just to see it in action so that they can say, this is real for us, this is realistic. And so Rosetta Stone is a little bit of my baby, but one of the other things that happened in that contract is that we did a pay schedule for that contract so that we could support 15 years of software updates from the time of the contract being signed, so that it wasn't like a one and done. And now for the next 20 years total, 6 and 15, we have the opportunity, and as long as that contract stays in place, we have language revitalization at our fingertips. And I'm telling you, it was very controversial. We had a lot of people in our community, in our territory, that were really pushing back on it, because language is not of value to them in their life, even in their everyday life. It's so far gone for them that they feel as if it's a waste of money. And I know that having worked with fluent speakers for the past 2 decades, all they ever wanted was for children to speak their language. All we ever want is for our tribes to live forever.
Can I ask you a question about that? First off, it's really exciting that you've partnered with an app, and I understand why I know that there's such a wave of language recovery going on, and that platform might be a way that all of the languages can not only be recovered, but as a language library, right? A living language library that is continuing to grow and be alive with the communities. But you and I had long discussions about, there's so many things you could talk about today to this community, and to give your personal story, which I think is a beautiful one. And somebody had put in the chat, the feed's been going and going, but our language is our health is one of the most beautiful, insightful sentences I've ever heard. So I wanted to give you that communication. Um, so we had, I had told you I was going to ask you that huge question about the future, like seeing the future. Um, and I believe that once the app is in place, once more of the community is fluent again, the resistant portion um, will be able to see the benefit, because that's just how humans are. Like some of
Sure.
us are like, oh, why bother? And then it's like, oh, well, that's why we bother, right? But is there anything you want to communicate to us about um, sharing that understanding that you hold on every level about how the language is part of your health? It's the container for your wisdom and your history and your ancestors and your land and your relationship to each other and the land. Um, how do you share that with the part of the community that is is having a hard time remembering? Yeah,
You know,
I think that's a good question.
that's a good question. I would say that I take as many instances to use language in public as I can with people who I know are learning language. So second language learners themselves. Um, it's uncomfortable because you don't know if they're going to be able to respond, and then it's very awkward, right, to work with folks who might not be understanding. But I speak Ojibwe to my children in public as much as possible, and I think that helps normalize it. And then when we do have ceremonies where these other folks come in from Warukuraring, the school I mentioned, those children come to our ceremonies, and then I have kids that I can speak to very comfortably, and they respond to me, and people are like, this is happening. You know, people who have not visited us, or maybe just haven't experienced children from that school, we're renormalizing it that way.
Right.
um
It's
I wanted
happening.
it is happening, and I wanted to add quickly that the future is seeing the gaps, and instead of trying to navigate and solely rely on navigating on tribal communities, our tribal governments to, in a very toxic bureaucratic way, support initiatives that we know are right, that we know in our hearts are important. We are empowering ourselves now to design nonprofit organizations so that we can meet these particular needs. And so I'm happy to say that the Midwest Indigenous Immersion Network is went from an idea in a conversation I had during a fellowship to a real thing. And now we have, I would say, I would say like a $500,000 commitment for some programming for this coming year, which is going to be
Wonderful.
helpful because we're trying to create that pipeline of, we have to create teachers so that we have teachers to teach children. We just don't have enough people who are teachers. So we have created
So
a
it's a
partnership.
progress.
Yeah, we created a partnership there so that we're creating teachers at Nakoda University, and so that pipeline is just kicking off. We're just like brand new baby stuff. But the other thing is the Warukuraring Ojibwe Language Institute has over 20 years of experience. They've been here since like 2000. They were established in 2000. They're in their 23rd, 24th year, and I would say that Indian tribes, Indian communities, Indians in general are receiving less than 1% of philanthropic giving. And we have research that shows that. And so we are working at developing relationships, even though we're in very remote communities in northern United States and northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. We're trying to build relationships with folks who are going to help support the stability and the long-term success of those programs.
Wonderful. So partnershiping towards the future is a great way to move forward. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was super informative about the process of bringing a language back. It's not an easy thing. You've done an amazing job, and I think partnering with a platform is so contemporary and a way to make it super accessible. And the idea of creating that for all of the languages of all the nations is a potential. Thank you so much. Just because of time, we're going to have to go forward now. So, folks, we're running late because these are fabulous speakers. So, to honor Elder Philomene is living in a very remote area. Her tribe, the Lakota Stoney Nation, was displaced off of their native lands to make Banff Park, National Park in Canada. They're in a remote area where, as a people, they are gatherers and harvesters of the wild foods, so they have no food source or land to grow on. Land that is ample to grow on. The land that they have now is not arable. So they have a lot of health issues because of that. They also have extreme poverty with all the problems that go along with that, and they're in a remote area that has very spotty Wi-Fi and cell signal. So she has not been able to join us today, but we knew that this might be an issue, so we recorded her answering a few questions, and we're going to play that recording so you can listen to Elder Philomene communicate the needs of her nation. And we're not going to really cover too much today the issue of racism and violence against Indigenous women, including in her area, is one of the areas where it's a high disappearance area in the Pacific Northwest. There is going to be a panel tomorrow, a parallel panel held by another NGO covering disappearances. So if you look at your schedule, you can find that one. I'm sure it's going to be a very important panel to attend. I think it's maybe at the 10 or 10:30 time slot tomorrow. I have it on my schedule. So look for that if you want to know more about what's going on in the area. But we're going to play her film now, a film of her. And then if anybody wants to stay for some questions afterwards, we'll do that. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce you to Elder Philomene Stevens from Morley, Alberta, Canada. And the first question is, talk about where you grew up.
Ambo States. Good day. My name is Philomene Stevens, and my traditional name is Makotimuya, Mother Earth Woman. I was born and raised in Minisni by my parents, who were prominent elders in the community. I learned from many elders throughout my early childhood and was taught the Lethka language, stories, and ceremonies. And I carry on what my parents started, helping people, mostly youth and women in different communities, and teaching them about Lethka culture. I started out as a traditional knowledge keeper of the Lethka Stoney. I work as a community developer, traveling across North America, and I have developed and delivered workshops on culture, health, leadership, Lethka language, and provided healthy, positive living tools. And presentations at the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies, Town of Canmore, Banff Center for the Arts and Creativity, Rocky Mountain School Division, and Morley Community School. I'm also a contributor to the development of the Stoney Language Dictionary. I currently live in the area where my ancestors were from, Chiniki Lake, and I am a residential school survivor. I am the matriarch of the family, an elder knowledge keeper who would like to spend time with families. I enjoy cooking traditional meals and sharing, teaching about different plants and their uses when walking in the forest with youth. I attended Mount Royal Family Prevention course and trained at Portage College as a crisis counselor. And I worked at the Eagle's Nest Women's Shelter for many years. My father's side are known as the people of the lake. My father's traditional name is Thiktahnehneh, spotted bird. John Stevens. He's the son of Paul Amos, Sintogedahnehneh, spotted wolf. Great-grandfather did not have an English name. He was called Tatangayamni, 3 buffaloes. Tatangayamni was the first to teach George Pocatera the Iesca Stoney language. George Pocatera is an Italian, and George was adopted by 3 buffaloes. My great-grandfather was fluent in the Iesca language and lived in teepees with the community. George would help my grandfather and prominent trade between Iesca and settlers. George owned the Buffalo Head Ranch in Kananaskis area. On my mother's side is my grandmother. My father's mother is Jane Salter. Wasijuyan. Jane's mother is Hannah Dixon. Makuchimuyan, the name I carry today. She is the sister of Lazarus Dixon, Ohandisa, Red Cloud. And family tree also includes Chief Taotha Peter Wesley on my mother's side, the Wesley clan. He was the hereditary chief for 34 years and was instrumental in developing of Bighorn Reserve, Otis Sunsal Reserve, and located west of Rocky Mountain House. I learned from many elders throughout my early childhood and was taught the Iliesca language, stories, and ceremonies, and I carry on what my parents started, helping people, mostly youth and women in different communities, and teaching them about Iesca culture. I'm a traditional knowledge keeper of the Iesca Stoney. I work as a community ambassador traveling across North America and has developed and delivered workshops on cultural, health, leadership, Iesca language, and provided healthy, positive living tools, and has delivered presentations in the nearby communities. Yes.
Second question is, what does poverty looks like today for your community, and how do you feel?
Poverty is poverty, how I feel that most of the important in the communities are indigenous communities in poverty due to the consequences of government not keeping their promises as presented in any of the treaties. There have not been sufficient and acceptable reparation. The removal of many indigenous peoples from national parks and placed on reserves has resulted in families not having access to fresh food. Stonies were removed from Banff National Park and Peter Lougheed Provincial Park, Kananaskis area, where we traditionally gather food and medicine. By not having access to these resources, many are now diabetic, and many have depression, which has led to drug and alcohol abuse. Many young and old community members have passed away. So I'm hoping for change in government at all levels, in school and on the reserve.
What can be done? What will the future look like?
What will the future look like?
Access to local. Where?
Okay. What can be done and what will look? Access to locations where food is harvested, plants and animals, make it easier to access these spaces in park and on private land. Provide educational opportunities for gardening, ranching opportunities, raise bison, elk. Indigenous own will help create opportunities instead of relying on other people to get food.
Pen. Baabiitaw.
What I said, in because there's so little space on the reserves, and that prevented us, and it's so hard for us to get food. We used to get our plants and harvest plants and use them for medicinal use, and that was helping us before. But now it's parks and mostly private land, and we can't access any of those properties, and that has prevented us from really that's where poverty is that it's preventing us from entering parks to get our food and that's where we harvest all our food and our fish and berries, and then we used to harvest that, and that will get us through the winter. But now we have no access to that, and that's where a lot of people, mostly the young people, they have just turned to drugs and they go to the city. That's where a lot of the children are placed in homes, foster homes, and that's where they lose their identity. And when they come back, when they're 18, they have no idea of what was happening, and some committed suicide of that. And most of the ones that move to the city, we bring them back in caskets and bury them. But there are still some traditional people that, like myself and my family and a few other families, that we do our very best to keep our culture, our traditions, so that we can and bring back what was taught by our ancestors. And that's what we are really working on at this time, hoping to get better. Yes.
Okay, Yasmin is going to co-moderate now and take over the questions in the chat. So if you have any questions for either of our speakers, I apologize for ending the presentations on such an intense note, but it's the reality for the life of the Stoney Nakoda Nation right now in Alberta. And once again, one of the things that they need that Ontario has been able to provide, the ONWA network has provided a group of lawyers in Ontario that were able to get access to their national park lands back for the Indigenous community. So we're hoping that the Lakota Stoney Nation can be restored to Banff. Again, that's our hope for the future for them. And I'm sorry that Elder Philomene cannot join us today, but one of the issues of poverty in her community is that they don't have good Wi-Fi or cell, so she wasn't able to join us in person. So go ahead and take it over, Yasmin, and if you have any questions that you haven't dropped in the chat, please do. Everyone, thank you. We can't hear you, Yasmin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. One of the questions that we have is for Denisa, and it's what the importance of the factors for health and how they need to be considered when you're modeling um, emancipation and freedom for your community. What does that look like? And also, if you have another question, please drop it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question and modeling health, but also planning for health as we face nutritional trauma and as we continue this work as the leaders in the process of creating change for our communities, because we know that changing our diet, requires several generations to be able to do that. We need to be able to be patient in the work that we're doing. And what does health look like is, like my sister Baabiitaw had mentioned, that we are planning for future generations. Like we need to secure and know that future generations will exist with our language, with traditional healing modalities, traditional healing frameworks. And I had mentioned in my presentation about our contribution of creating social determinants of health equity. And the social determinants of health equity includes culture. It includes healthy retail. For example, I talked a little bit about target marketing, and I'm on a national sugar reduction team to address policies on the local level to the federal level. And one of the key things is retail marketing that is targeted negatively towards our communities. And this is across the world. We've been in different areas, really taking a look at sugar cartels and the impacts that they've had on Indigenous communities and the lack of health that exists in our communities across the world. And part of looking at the retail marketing is helping our tribal citizens to take the responsibility to go to their convenience store, to the grocery stores, to have relationships, to be able to impact the foods that are held there, to also advocate on behalf of better healthcare, because most of our healthcare around Indigenous nations is provided by the U.S. government, and it's substandard. We've seen through the pandemic the lack of quality healthcare that exists. And it is definitely a combination of many factors to be able to know that the resilience, and then also planning for perpetuity and changing that mindset is important when we model health. But the pandemic really has widened that sickness, has widened disease, has widened that burden upon our people. So now countering that, the resurgence of Indigenous advocacy regarding global climate, crises, flooding, climate change, the mitigation of fires, but also knowing that our food systems is based in spirituality, in the prophecies, and then also in the prayers and in our language. My sister from my tribe, Dr. Lila June, she's been part of the new documentary, if you guys have seen it, Common Ground. And it's talking about regenerative agriculture, and we've been advocating for the increase of biodiversity, that monocropping is not the way that our tradition has been, planting one type of corn after row, and tilling the ground in this method that was forced upon our people. We need to be able to plant with the other sisters, the squash, the beans, the pumpkins, the watermelons, the sunflowers. There's a whole way of how we plan for health, but also for the environment, for the community, and for one another. There is more to understanding how we are doing this work. And go to our website at dineadvocacy.org, because we are tuning in, but also contributing to different dialogues held locally, but also in the rest of the world. And then one recommendation I want to also make for everyone, including the books that I had on my slides, is read the book, What Your Food Ate. And back to you. You're on mute, Yasmin.
How about now? You can hear me? Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. So the next question is actually mine. And when we take a look at the U.S. government's current continued violent colonization in indigenous lands, for example, in Palestine currently, the weaponization of food and water, as well as the colonization of language in indigenous lands in the global South in general, does this make you less hopeful for reclamation of your rights in the U.S.? Or do you look to other lands that are currently, or other indigenous people who are currently going through similar trials and tribulations for hope or guidance on how to reclaim what's yours?
I think that question may be for both of us. Okay, I'll pass it to my sister. I can respond briefly because I'm taking some time. It's very complex, right? Because we in the pandemic have, like I had mentioned, increased our advocacy and making awareness of what has happened to our indigenous peoples. And like I had mentioned, federal Indian law, when there is the complexity of trilateral governance, when the federal government, the state government, and local governments have to work together, but mostly the superintendents of the federal governance over tribes and not allowing tribes to exert and practice our autonomy and also polycentricity. It's really important how we untangle all of this mess. And also reprogramming our tongue, reprogramming our growing, knowing that we have to have transformative agendas. We have to be going through this transformative phase and stage and processes, what we're putting in our mouth, how we feed our heart, how we feed our mind, our spirit, and knowing that we're responsible for our descendants, that we are the ancestors responsible for the change that's coming. And this is going to take, a much longer time for resistance, for reparations, for reconciliation in the world, because the injustices are very complex and led by these power systems that we have to deconstruct and face. But also as women, we need to be supported because this work is heavy, it's challenging, it's discouraging many times, and we need more women and girls to have the courage and have the abilities and capabilities to know that they can do it. And so when we think about the agendas that are at the House or the Senate, or even in our tribal councils, or even at the tribal community meetings, we need to advocate towards more of the emancipation, right? So that our people have the political will, that they have the social will, so that they can, be freed from the weaponry of food and also beverages, because we're placing these systems very strategically. And I say that as community organizers, our climate change is to organize better. We need to organize better because these power systems have already organized for generations. They've already organized the next food item that is considered healthy. They're already organized, the food science of what we are putting in our system, not knowing, that it's very unhealthy. And so as organizers, we need to be able to organize better. And how do we do that? How do we plan that? And I really appreciate this convening today, because we need more support. We need more solidarity around tribal health and understanding how complex that tribal health is. And then also we need to reactivate the trading routes. The traditional trading routes from where I'm at, from the Southwest, went all the way down to Central America, went all the way down to the Mayan people, went all the way down, and traded, with peoples across the borders. And that is something even to the north. Our people went across the border freely. And if we don't reactivate those trading routes, we're also withholding the healing that needs to take place too. So lots of different aspects of thinking about how we do this, but negotiating also for what has been sitting at Congress is what's called the Native Seeds Protection Act that has been sitting there for a couple years now. We need protections over our seeds, because if we don't have protections and legal protections over our native seeds, then we're not going to see a future of protection of heirloom traditional indigenous seeds that would be able to grow in generations to come. So lots of different things, but pass it on to my sister here, Baabiitaw.
Thank you. And Yasmin, can you repeat the question? Because I was soaking up everything that Denisa was saying. And I want to make sure that I'm hitting it right. I know
Me
that
too.
I know that when you asked me the first time, or when you asked the question the first time, I had emotional responses and I had immediate responses, but I'll let you say it again.
Yeah, so when we look at the U.S. government's current part in the continued violent colonization of indigenous lands and peoples across the world and in general the global South, specifically I think about Palestine when I ask this question, the weaponization of food and water, as well as the colonization of the language. How does this make you feel in terms of when you're thinking about how to reclaim your rights, how to reclaim your land, and how to kind of get justice? Do you feel disheartened and saddened by what's going on, or are you looking to other communities facing similar tribulations for inspiration or strategy in terms of how moving forward?
Sure. I immediately felt saddened and disheartened, and as an adult now, and somebody who is as aware as I am of my own self and the things that have happened to people here in the United States, Indigenous people here in the United States, I am not surprised. I'll say that much, is that it's something that I have kind of accepted, that is when we think about peace and we think about these types of things not happening someday in this beautiful world of ours, I don't feel like it's happening right here in my lifetime. But I know that the work that we're doing together and the relationships that we're building together, we're growing our like a whole collective awareness about it. And so I'm hopeful still. But when I think about and you hear the stories, or you're watching the news, and you see the devastation that's happening, and you know who's responsible for it, I go straight to gratitude because of the capabilities and my reach that I have personally. And I think about what I have control over as far as my quality of life, my children's quality of life, and what kind of impact I can have as an individual and as a community leader. And then I think about for as far as the United States goes with tribes here, the treaties are the law of the land, but there isn't a treaty that the United States hasn't broken with us. There's not one single one. And so the thing of it is that the majority of the protections that are built in treaty now, the tribes have, if they don't have it directly, they have it in partnership with one another. They have the support to advocate for one another and lobbying and protecting each other more so than we ever have. And so I think about this collective indigenous support system that we have that helps to lobby, advocate, and secure and make pathways to secure those initiatives that we hold most dearest when it comes to protecting and developing food systems, our traditional food systems, and protecting our ways of being, our ways of life, and our languages. I'm very, very hopeful, but yes, I'm very, very sad and dismayed at what's happening in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up this meeting. I want to thank you guys all for joining, whether you were presenting or just a listener. This is my first service moderation situation. So thank you as well to Rachel for having me and organizing this as well. I don't know if you have any last things to say, Rachel.
I have one other thing. So if you haven't been in the CSW 68 NGO portal, if you got a direct link to this meeting, to this panel, I encourage you to go into the portal, the VFairs portal. If you click on each of our speakers' names, it'll give you all kinds of information about them and links to their associations, their websites, everything. So you can stay in contact. If you have organizations that are helpful to them, you can, their contact information is in the portal. So the VFairs CSW 68 portal. So please reach out to them and continue the conversation. there's many questions I'm sure that we didn't get answered, so much information that we did receive, and there's so much more to do. So keep it going, everyone. And thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate it. This will also go up on our Servas YouTube channel. I'm not sure when. Where's our tech person? Daniel, are you there?
In the next couple days.
Yeah, great. So look for it there. It's definitely worth re-listening for me. There was so much that I want to hear again, and yes, and also please look up Elder Philomene's information and reach out to her and her community. I'm sure she would appreciate it. And thank you so much.